Hello, I'm Wyatt, and today I'm going to be talking about corporate actions and societal responses, specifically as it relates to food autonomy. We're going to be looking at two case studies here. One is of corporate overreach, and we'll see that in the case study of Coca-Cola and the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. Next, we're going to be talking about corporate withdrawal, which is going to be explained in the case of Russia as they've lost Western companies. Then I'm going to tie everything together with a little Coca-Cola conclusion, and then I will show my sources. So, to begin, Chiapas con Coca-Cola, Chiapas with Coca-Cola. So, Coca-Cola has set up shop in Chiapas. One important thing to know about the state of Chiapas is that it is incredibly rainy. It is one of the wettest states in all of Mexico, and that's exactly why Coca-Cola set up shop in Chiapas, specifically in a town called San Cristobal. And there they pump over 300,000 gallons of water per day. This naturally has disrupted groundwater availability to the point where only 7% of San Cristobal's population trusts the city's groundwater. The city's groundwater is either A, not available because it's completely dried up, or B, polluted when it is available and therefore not safe for consumption. And so instead of drinking groundwater, tap water, the average person from San Cristobal instead drinks 180 gallons of Coca-Cola per year. Now, Coca-Cola has responded to this in a multi-vectored approach, and essentially an information or an influence campaign. On one hand, they have done public influence campaigns that stress how important the company is to the Mexican economy, and they make up about 1% of Mexico's GDP. They have framed the obesity crisis that has popped up in San Cristobal as a lack of exercise problem, and certainly not a Coca-Cola consumption problem. In fact, a little bit of sugar in your drink never hurt nobody. Next, they've worked with the Mexican Red Cross, and in so partnering with the Mexican Red Cross have promoted Isolite as the official beverage of the Mexican Red Cross. So it's not necessarily Coca-Cola like the soft drink, but it still is a Coca-Cola product. And then finally, they've developed government and media relationships to further strengthen Coca-Cola's hold in the region. Now, an interesting, almost maybe more philosophical question comes up with how much does a well cost? On the left, we have an image of a well, one of the wells that pumps out 300,000 gallons of water per day. On the right, we have a resident of San Cristobal, and you'll notice there is a bag hanging from the ceiling. In this bag is not groundwater, instead it is rainwater that is stored in bags just like that in order to have a fresh source of drinking water and a source of hydration that is not Coca-Cola. To that end, the people of San Cristobal have been severely impacted by this type of corporate overreach. We're seeing health issues in San Cristobal, such as dental problems from drinking Coke, dehydration of infants, and most concerning, type 2 diabetes, which has become San Cristobal's largest killer. In fact, 11.2% of the population, so over 1 in every 10 people, was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 2019. Now, health issues aren't the only issues that have come from this corporate overreach. Alterations to traditions, rituals, and even medicinal practices have been observed. Pascuala is on the left, and she is a local healer in San Cristobal. She stated that, quote, Coca-Cola is sweet, so the spirits will appreciate it, and it also has certain healing properties, end quote. Now, Coca-Cola does not have any medicinal properties, but it is interesting how ingrained Coca-Cola is to the point where healing practices are now being enacted with Coca-Cola. And you'll notice in the image there are a whole bunch of different icons and flowers and candles and 2 Coca-Cola bottles. Now, so we have an example of corporate overreach. Now we'll talk a little bit about corporate withdrawal. In our section, Россия без западных компаний, Russia without Western companies. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Western companies were pretty quick to leave Russia, many leaving in 2022, just months after the invasion. And this left a food supply vacuum in the place where the Western companies used to be. Now, it's important to understand Western food in Russia as it's a relatively recent phenomenon. The first Western food company in Russia opened on 31 Jan 1990. It was a McDonald's, and that McDonald's saw the single greatest day of McDonald's profit ever, as it served over 30,000 customers in just one day. McDonald's would go on and expand their franchise in Russia to own over 800 specific franchise locations and employ over 62,000 employees. Now, when McDonald's left Russia, it retained an option to buy back franchises if the conflict ends. And the Russian government is trying to stop this. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, Russia, in this regard, has been pushing towards a nutritional self-sufficiency ever since the end of the Soviet Union, though primarily through current President Vladimir Putin. Now, the idea is that a nutritional self-sufficiency, so being able to do all of the farming and manufacturing and distribution and processing of food entirely within Russia, that this would shield Russia from conflict with the West and avoid food shortfalls that were common during Soviet times, or at least relatively common compared to their Western counterparts. There's also a strand of manufactured patriotism wrapped up in all of this self-reliance. And that actually is a little bit of where the Russian government trying to stop McDonald's from coming back into Russia comes from, because they see it as unpatriotic, or at least the narrative pushed is that it's unpatriotic for Western companies to come back after they abandoned Russia because of the invasion. Now, this self-sufficiency that Russia has been driving towards it actually has been tested in the past before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and then again in COVID-19, Russia's food self-sufficiency proved resilient. It wasn't completely fine through those crises of A, Western sanctions, and then B, COVID-19. Prices rose for the average Russian. In just 6 years, the prices rose 15.6% for food. That being said, in the midst of that tumultuous period where prices were already high, Russia invaded Ukraine. So what's changed for the average Russian surrounding food because of the invasion? Well, Russians are now more likely to buy seasonal food items. 11% of Russians stopped buying fresh fruit in the winter since it wasn't seasonal and therefore it was exorbitantly priced, up from 6% in 2022. So just in 1 year, double the amount of people stopped buying fresh fruit. Next is that, shockingly, 92% of Russians grow food in small gardens. Most of this food, nearly all of this food, is for individual consumption. It's not for production or to be sold on the markets. It's to supplement any food intake that Russians would normally have. Shagaida et al. 2023 noted that, quote, "It is unlikely that Russians' passion for gardening is determined by the desire to provide their families with organic food. It is rather a reaction to the social economic situation," end quote. And of course, that social economic situation brought upon by the invasion of Ukraine. Two other things is that the average purchasing power of Russians compared to their Western counterparts has diminished in the time of the invasion, but was also in a bit of peril during COVID-19 and even 2014 during the invasion, but especially in light of the invasion and the massive amount of Western sanctions, the average Russian's purchasing power plummeted. And in the place where Western food companies used to be, new Russian food services have popped up. One example of that is Vkusnoye Tochka, essentially meaning tasty and that's it. They are the primary company that inherited McDonald's legacy in Russia. You can almost see it as well in the architecture. None of that really changed, just the branding. Now, Vkusnoye Tochka has actually turned a profit in the short term, though there are some economists that doubt long-term sustainability. It's interesting that when McDonald's left, Vkusnoye Tochka had to manufacture the entire food supply chain all over again in order to run the company. So that's farms, kitchen equipment, distribution equipment, all of that had to be remade in the wake of McDonald's leaving. And the CEO actually is trying to take that technology that has been created in Russia and essentially make Vkusny Tochka a hub in terms of technological advancement for the Russian public catering market. Now, interestingly, Western products have not entirely left Russia. This image is an image of a shelf in Russia, and we'll notice a couple familiar faces. We see Dr. Pepper, Fanta, Sprite, and of course, Coca-Cola, though in Chinese is Coca-Cola. Interesting that these products haven't left, and part of this is because of small-scale importers. Essentially, people, whether it's online and through e-commerce or through like people physically driving, essentially will go to countries that surround Russia and buy Western food products in those countries and then bring them back to Russia in order to sell them at retail price. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that sometimes the prices will be different based upon where the food item came from. So an example given was there was Coca-Cola that was imported from Poland and England, and the English one cost more than the Polish one. And so the same product may be on the same shelf, so Coca-Cola, but since one is from England and one is from Poland, the English one costs more and the Polish one doesn't cost as much. So that's interesting. Two is that Coca-Cola has undoubtedly noticed an increase in demand in most of the countries that border Russia. Coca-Cola has done nothing about this, when the obvious implication there is that that increase in demand isn't necessarily because people from, say, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan are just somehow more into Coca-Cola all of a sudden, but it's because of the parallel importation that's happening where, again, people drive into somewhere like Kazakhstan, buy all the Coke they can, and then drive back. So, a quick Coca-Cola conclusion, just because it's on my mind and it sounds fun. But all that to say, despite the product of Coca-Cola being the same, I think this actually serves as a lens for us to view what essentially the impact of corporations can be onto societies. So in one society, in San Cristobal, we see corporate overreach, where health, ritual, tradition, even environment have been not just changed, but turned in favor of extraction and exploitation. The people in San Cristobal, as a bottom line, aren't drinking Coca-Cola necessarily because they like it. There are some that probably like Coca-Cola, that's undeniable. But really, it's because they don't have much of any other choice. And part of this is because there is no groundwater for people in San Cristobal to drink. It's also because of influence campaigns that the Coca-Cola company has enacted in the region. Ultimately, in San Cristobal, lives have been cut short, and yet Coca-Cola still keeps pumping water out. And if that's not corporate overreach, I don't know what is. Now, on the other hand, in Russia, corporate withdrawal has displayed dependency, essentially, with Western companies leaving Russia relatively quickly after Russia invaded Ukraine. It showed how integrated Russia had become into the global food system, even if there was this idea or legacy of national self-independence regarding food. I mean, we saw higher prices, longer wait times in Russia. We saw small-scale importing in all of the countries that surround Russia. And not just that, but we've also seen Russians having to cope in ways that are almost unimaginable, having to make their own gardens. And even with making their own gardens, that hasn't been enough. And so many Russians sought a sense of normalcy. And to that end, are buying products, even though their relative purchasing power has diminished, buying products even at a markup at times in order to regain maybe a sense of what was lost, a taste of Coca-Cola that was once so easily accessible but now costs a bit more, since Russia had become a pariah on the world stage. And I think that both of these examples combined, one of corporate withdrawal and one of corporate overreach, really display how important food autonomy is. In both San Cristobal and Russia, people lost autonomy for food choices when these corporations have made decisions in their respective places. So as Coca-Cola has made decisions, and San Cristobal and Coca-Cola or any of the Western companies have made decisions in Russia that has impacted tangibly the people on the ground. And people are forced to conform to the conditions that the companies have set in those locations. And ultimately, I think that both of these cases highlight how the unequal power of corporations compared to the power of everyday people serves to essentially display how people cope with a lack of food autonomy. And in some cases, that is trying to buy Western products from other countries, and in some cases, that is being forced to consume what the company is giving because there are no other options. And that concludes everything I have to say about this topic. I found it a very fascinating research, and I'm glad that I was able to look at dichotomies in the system because it's not black and white. It's nuanced, as everything is. It's not a question of corporate overreach is always bad and corporations should always get out there, because in a sense, people have suffered both in terms of corporate overreach and in corporate withdrawal, and that impacts us at maybe the most intimate level, where our companies have been so intertwined with some of the most intimate aspects of our life, eating and drinking, that both an overreach and a withdrawal can have serious negative effects on people. So with that, these are my sources. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day. Thank you.